Welcome everybody to the latest in our alumni series of events. This evening's event is not around Tyburn River, as the slide incorrectly said. I do apologise for that. It is of course around the Westminster Palaces as advertised, so you are completely in the right place. It gives me great pleasure to welcome as our speaker this evening Mr. Peter Burley, an alum of the University of York, and known to many of you as a dedicated member of the York Global Alumni Association London Committee. Peter has hosted many of these events for us and is an absolutely inspiring and enthralling speaker, so I'm sure you'll enjoy this event very much. A couple of housekeeping measures for me just to run through with you before the event actually starts, and I hand you over to Peter. First of all, the event is being recorded. Your images are not being recorded, your voices are not being recorded, you're muted and hidden, but the event itself is being recorded. You are able to access the live transcript, or indeed to toggle that off if you prefer. If you hover down at the bottom, you'll be able to see the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose whether or not you would like to have that on. And finally, the last piece of housekeeping from me before I hand over to Peter. After Peter has given his talk this evening, there'll be an opportunity to ask him questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on that, and if you have any questions, do feel free to post any questions as they occur to you as we go along. Or alternatively, you can wait at the end, and then I will curate your questions and pass those to Peter for him to answer at the end.
Okay, so we now got the title of the talk. You should all be seeing it, Palaces in Westminster on the North Bank of the Thames. But it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, so I go back to the title, and welcome you to this guided tour and talk. I've run this talk as tour, I'd say, as a physical event about 10 years ago. So a couple of you in the audience, who obviously can't see you, may have been with me then. This version is a bit different though, so you wouldn't be exactly duplicating what we did before. There is a new material, and I'm going to use Zoom to change some of the running order and to give it more of a better flow to doing it the way you can on the ground. If you do this walk physically, and I highly recommend it, the big advantage of going from south to north, which is how I did it before, is that all the good cafes and pubs are at the north end of the walk. We're going to be doing it from north to south, because that gives a better flow, but it means you're going to have to be responsible for finding your own something to drink at the end of it. So that's where we are, and I will now start with saying that we're looking at palaces, and I'm defining palaces as somewhere that's built or lived in by royalty, a bishop's residence or a duke's residence. And we have a run of palaces all the way from the western boundary of the City of London right the way to Westminster. That's Westminster Palace and Westminster Abbey. The other thing I need to say, just as a thank you, is that most of the images here are taken from Google Earth and are marked with their logo, or from Wikipedia. And thank you very much for those two things. Now, what all these buildings have in common is that they're a domestic residence as well as being a political power base. All of them had medieval origins, with bishops, kings, or dukes. They all run from the Strand or Whitehall on the landward side down to the river. All of them originally had a main entrance from the river via a Watergate. And we're actually going to see a couple of these surviving Watergates on the tour. And they all obviously had a private dock. They were all fortified on the landward side. And inside the palace boundary, they usually had at least one fortified tower. And then the sites all contained at least a chapel and a great hall, as well as living accommodation, boathouse, stables, and other such like service equipment. Now, let's have a look at the lie of the land as to what we're looking at. This is a slightly messy slide, but we're starting up here with this arrow here at the eastern end of the Strand, or the western end of Fleet Street. Then we'll be walking round the north bank of the river down to Westminster. We'll be ending here at Westminster, and then I've arrowed in the dozen or so sites we'll be looking at. What I've also done is we're going to start actually with a brief interlude at the beginning down here in Victoria Tower Gardens, just south of the Palace of Westminster, looking across the river to Lambeth Palace. And then we're going to jump back up to that north and east end of the walk and follow it round there. Now, the reason for starting with Lambeth Palace is it's our benchmark. It meets every criterion I have talked about. It's also an extraordinary survival. It's been there since 1197, and it's been the home of the Archbishops of Canterbury. It's their domestic residence. It's the headquarters of the Church of England. And as I say, it is a palace in every sense of the word. It has its own private landing stage. It was protected by defensive walls. It contains fortified towers and a great hall and a chapel. It has all the ancillary buildings that support an aristocratic lifestyle. And originally, it was set in the middle of a deer park. Now, all our other sites are going to have at least some of those features. None of them actually have all of them, but that is the benchmark by which to judge them against. And we'll have a much closer look at Lambeth Palace in a moment. Now, the other reason for looking at this is the Westminster bank of the Thames is why these palaces were there. And the reasons for that were twofold. Firstly, the north bank was higher ground, which didn't flood. So it's a very good building site. And linked to that, the building of London Bridge in 1209 actually reduced the tidal flow of the river, making it quite by chance much more amenable for getting to and from buildings by water and for building closer to the water's edge. You had a much more predictable high tide line. The other reason is to do with property ownership. In the City of London, all the land to the east of where we're going to start was owned originally by the Knights Templar, and then it passed to the Inns of Court. So land wasn't available for bishops, dukes, kings, whatever, to build their palaces on. Now, the next thing to look at is who actually shaped what we're going to be looking at today. And the main mover and shaper is this man, Henry VIII. And the reason for that is that most of the sites we're going to see fell into his hands in three different episodes. Originally, the very extensive Savoy Palace had been owned by the Crown, and there were other bits of Crown estate along the line we're going to see. Then in 1529, Henry seized all of Cardinal Wolsey's property, which included the Palace of Whitehall and the Palace at Scotland Yard. And then in 1539, he seized all the church property from Whitehall, running eastwards and northwards up to the boundary of the City of London, starting with the first site we'll look at Essex House. So he's the man who actually shapes the landscape we're looking at. But the person who describes it best, and our main guide for this evening, is the Elizabethan antiquarian John Stowe, and he lived 1525 to 1605. I'll be taking a lot of quotes from his survey of London in 1598, and it has a description of every site we're going to look at. Now, our route, if you do it physically, is about 2 miles long, and it zigzags along the riverbank from the north to the south. So we're starting at the boundary between the cities of London and Westminster, or the City of London and the City of Westminster, I should say, and is where Fleet Street becomes the Strand. And Strand, of course, is simply an old name for shoreline. So if you're looking on a map to follow the route, you want to find that point where the Strand and Fleet Street meet and where the Royal Courts of Justice are, and then you can follow it on the ground from there. But before we do that, I'm going to use the magic of Zoom to give you a much more detailed description of Lambeth Palace. Now, here we have Lambeth Palace looking across the river from Victoria Tower Gardens, and you need to get quite some distance from it to get all the buildings in one shot, as you can see. And I'll now unpack what you're looking at. Here you can see a boat, and we've got the landing stage, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury's private landing stage for several centuries. It would have been, say, it was a private landing stage. Today it's private again, but it is used for river cruises. It's not used for any public ferry services. The last ferry left from here in the middle of the 18th century. Now, behind that, you've obviously got the Victorian embankment, but behind that you can see a brick wall. And this is the defensive wall that surrounded the entire complex. It's actually slightly taller if you stand beside it. It looks at this photograph. It's about 10 feet tall. And the reason for it being that tall is not just to stop people climbing in, it's also to stop deer jumping out. Now, next back from that, you begin to get some of the defensive buildings. Here's the iconic Morton's Tower. We'll look at again in a moment. Here's the Lollards Tower. And these are the two big defensive towers inside the palace complex. And behind them are a number of other buildings, some Victorian, some medieval, peeping out. Again, we'll have a better look at them from a different angle in a moment. And you can see in here glimpses of the Great Hall and the chapel. And then behind this building here were originally all these sort of staff quarters and service buildings. Now, I owe a big thank you to a colleague called Cynthia Fletcher from UCA here, who claims she risked life and limb to get this photograph for us. This is taken from the top of the tower at St Mary's Church. Now, St Mary's Lambeth is the parish church for Lambeth, and it's just south of the palace. And now we were looking across the river, which is here. There's the defensive wall. This is a corner of Morton's Tower. Here you have the Victorian Library. There's the chapel. That's the Great Hall. And this building here is the early 19th century accommodation, which now actually houses the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the administrative offices for running the Church of England. And this area here, which is now empty, was, until this building was built, a huge clutter of stables and service buildings. And behind it, you've got the grounds, which, and what you're looking at here is actually the huge garden behind Lambeth Palace. And then it's twice the size again over in this direction is Archbishop's Park, which is a public park in Lambeth. Now, here's Morton's Tower, which is the iconic tower. And I don't know how Google Earth have managed to get rid of a lamppost, but it's an unobstructed view of this wonderful early Tudor building. And it looks like a castle, and it's meant to look like a castle. Now, here's a view of the whole complex. I've drawn a line around it. That's where the buildings are. And this is the whole of the original Archbishop's grounds. And it was a deer park as well as gardens, orchards, and whatever. So now this part belongs to the Archbishop. This part is part of St Thomas's Hospital, and this part is a public park, Archbishop's Park. But you can get the sheer scale of what's going on from that. Archbishop's Park was gifted to the people of Lambeth in the 19th century by the then Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, this is an aerial photograph, but again shows you the sheer scale of the whole operation. As I say, this is in macrocosm, what a lot of the things we'll be looking at later show in microcosm. And that, by the way, is St Mary's Church. There's the tower that Cynthia wobbled up to and leaned over to get the photograph. And just before we leave, let's have a look at the Great Hall. This is a wonderful medieval Great Hall inside the palace. I've been very privileged to get inside the palace on 3 occasions. Occasionally, it's open for what's called London Squares weekend, and you can get into the gardens and look around the buildings. The second times when the Royal Pharmaceutical Society that I was working for at the time persuaded the Archbishop to let us use the palace for a training day, and we had our briefing session in this room. It was wonderful. The third time was when they had an exhibition of medieval treasures from the library, in the library there, and that was a rare treat. Now, we're going to start our walk. Sorry, apologies for the cough. Lots of water here. That should help a bit. Right, we're now going back to where Fleet Street becomes the Strand, and we're walking along to go into this little alleyway here, which is very easy to miss on the ground, and it's called Devereux Court. And Devereux Court takes us to this building here, which is Essex House, which is the home of the Earl of Essex, who was Robert Devereux. Now, this is the first of our ex-bishop's palaces, which passed to Henry VIII at the Reformation and was then put into secular ownership and usually by a nobleman thereafter. And as I said, Elizabeth I's reign, it was the Earl of Essex who owned it. Now, this is the building that's on the site at the moment. The building is still there. Whether it's still a pub, I don't know. It was a very good pub and a very good end to the walk if you did it starting from the south. Now, I want you to have another look at this. You've got the defensive tower here. You've got the Watergate, the water entrance here with a little jetty. And just bear in mind this little road running up beside it. You'll see this again in a moment in a very, very different guise. Now, in the flyer, you were promised some exciting characters, and I think he's probably the most exciting we're going to meet this evening. It's Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. And of course, he was Elizabeth I's last favourite, and it didn't turn out well at the end of his life. In 1599, he rebelled against Elizabeth, turned Essex House into an arsenal, recruited a couple of hundred people with discontents against the regime, and led an armed rebellion. He tried to march on the city of London, but it was a complete fiasco, and he ended up fleeing back to Essex House after government forces outwitted him, and he surrendered when the government threatened to blow the Essex House apart with cannons that surrounded it. So that was his end, and he was eventually executed for treason. There's a wonderful 1936 Hollywood Weefy film called The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, and he's played there by Errol Flynn. That's right. A slight resemblance. Now that's Essex House. Now I told you to get your eye in on that little alleyway beside it. This is what it looks like today. And this is a steep flight of steps that comes down from Milford Lane down to Temple Place. And the point of showing you this is how steep the riverbank is. I mentioned earlier that the north bank of the Thames doesn't flood the way the south bank used to. And the reason is very simple. The flood water can't get up this height. And several places along this walk, there are these very steep flights of steps that get you from the top of the riverbank down to the foreshore. And we'll see some more of those as we go later on. Now, we've come down to Milford Lane, and I can't resist showing you this building. It's not one of our palaces, but it is exquisite. If you're in this part of London in the winter, you must go there because they have free art exhibitions all through the winter. It's a beautiful arts and crafts building. I won't say any more about it because it's completely irrelevant. Except to say, most of you will probably have seen inside this room here, because it's the room in which Lady Rose in Downton Abbey had her wedding reception. Now, next door to it, we come to the second of our palaces, Arundel House. Now, here's a picture of what's on the site now, which is the Victorian reimagining of what a medieval bishop's palace ought to have looked like. And here's a picture of actually what was on the ground for most of the site's history. Now, the land was originally owned by the bishops of Bath, but they were dispossessed of it by Henry VIII, who then passed it on to the Howard family, and specifically to the Earls of Arundel, hence the name Arundel House. The Howard family, held many titles, most importantly the Duke of Norfolk, and most of the roads in this part of the riverbank area still bear the names that commemorate the family. Now, what you can't see, and we'll look at later, is this is built on the reclaimed land from the embankment, and we'll do justice to that engineering episode shortly. So let's have a look at what the Howards held here, and their holding was quite a substantial estate. Now, we've been looking at, there's 2 Temple Place, we're looking at Arundel House, which houses the International Institute for Strategic Studies, but they own this whole batch of land round here. Now, what became of the original Arundel House? Well, along with all the other places we're going to see, it became progressively less fashionable. And by the late 17th century, the noble families who bought up the old bishops' palaces were beginning to retreat from this riverbank and move elsewhere. What happened to this particular site was that it was bought up by the second Duke of Buckingham in the Restoration period. The original medieval palace was demolished, and speculative tenements were built there. And these are the sort of places you'll come across in Dickens' novels, of places of ill repute and seedy dens. And in the 19th century, the buildings were in serious trouble all along here, and nearly all of them were demolished, replaced by new ones, coinciding with the redevelopment, the building of the embankment, and the redevelopment of the whole waterfront area. Now, we now come next to the next site, to our first royal building. And this is Somerset House. And it stood on the site of 3 former bishops' palaces. The site was assembled and cleared by Edward Seymour, who was Henry VIII's brother-in-law, and he acquired it after the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539. Then in 1547, Henry VIII died, and his son Edward VI ascended the throne as a boy, and Seymour became the Lord Protector, or equivalently to a regent, and elevated himself to being the Duke of Somerset, which is where the name Somerset comes from the house. Somerset wanted, quite literally, a palace fit for a king, and he commissioned this very ambitious design. Work had barely started, however, when Somerset was arrested for treason and executed. Well, John Stowe visited the site in the 1590s and said it was still mostly a building site. The work was far from finished. Then in 1601, James I ascended the throne, and this transformed the fortunes of Somerset House for a very unexpected reason. The first 4 Stuart kings all married Roman Catholic queens. Now, Roman Catholics couldn't partake in the full ceremonial of a Protestant court, so they needed their own separate palace for this. And the unfinished Tudor palace at Somerset House was swiftly completed by Indigo Jones. And this is mostly Indigo Jones' work we're seeing here, for those 4 queens who were installed there in succession. And the final phase of the building work, I think after this picture was taken, was completed by Sir Christopher Wren in the Restoration period. Then, of course, in 1688, the Catholic James II fled the country, and in 1689, it was actually made illegal for a British king or queen to be a Catholic. So the palace became redundant and was mothballed and fell into decay. Well, this is what you see here today on exactly the same site. And after nearly a century of neglect, the palace was demolished and replaced in 1775 by what was then the prestige government office development, to make good very belatedly, the lost government offices of the Palace of Whitehall, which we'll be looking at shortly. And it was as resplendent as any government buildings in other European capitals, and this was built to annoy the French, because conversely, the British had for decades been fed up with going to places like Paris, Versailles, or Madrid, and seeing magnificent public buildings housing the government, when they had a really squalid collection of rundown buildings spread around the place. So this was built to impress the French in particular. The architect was Sir William Chambers, and it's a wonderful Palladian design. Then from 1999 onwards, the government progressively withdrew from the building, and it's been transformed into an artistic and cultural hub. If you don't know it, it is so worth visiting. It's open almost every day. It has cafes, shops, and other facilities. One thing we got caught out on our walk, though, is if you do go there in the evening, occasionally the whole site can be taken over for a private function. So do check before you go outside normal opening hours. Now, I wanted to show you the most splendid feature of this building, which is its Watergate. This is the first of 2 Watergates we'll be looking at. Today, the Watergate has been kind of hidden by the embankment. And these 2 pictures really show the scale of the 19th century engineering work to create the embankment. Here's the top of the Watergate, and this is all what's left of it now. The rest of it is all reclaimed land, which has a road on top and a sewer and an underground railway underneath. But it gives an impression of just the sheer scale of it. Now, I talked earlier about that very steep staircase up to Essex House. Well, here the same thing happens. This is the ground level of the Strand. And if you go in this entrance, you have got a lot of steps to climb before you get to the courtyard, which is then level with the Strand on the other side of the building. Now, I wanted to give you a wider perspective next of how this building sits and then fits into the riverbank. So what we've got is Somerset House here, magnificent house, and then on the left, I've arrowed in the Savoy Hotel. And here we are on Waterloo Bridge, which was first built in the early 19th century. This is a post-Second World War new bridge here, but on the same, obviously, on the same level. It's also a chance to say, I'm not actually talking about every single site on this walk. There are a couple of palaces that don't have much of a history. There isn't much to say about them, so I will be skipping them. But we're now going to move on to look more closely at the Savoy Palace. And this is the Savoy Palace. And this is an imagined Victorian reconstruction of it. We don't have any engravings of it as a medieval building, either from the river or the landward side. So we've had to make do with reimagining from the various written descriptions. Now, the history of this site is it starts in 1245, when Henry III, who already owned the land, granted the site to Peter of Savoy, the uncle of his Queen Eleanor of Savoy. And that's where the name Savoy comes from. And Savoy has stuck with the site ever since, obviously with the Savoy Hotel now, but also the Savoy Opera Company. And they also take their name originally from that Peter of Savoy. When Peter died, the land reverted to the crown, and then its most famous resident was John of Gaunt, who was Duke of Lancaster and founder of the House of Lancaster. And he embellished the medieval palace to become the most opulent building in London. And it was encrusted on its facade with semi-precious stones. And of itself, it became a symbol of royal extravagance and misgovernment. And the theory was that all the money from the poll tax, which provoked the peasants' revolt, had been spent in embellishing the Savoy Palace. So in 1381, in the peasants' revolt, it was the symbol that was most hated, and it was attacked. And the revolting peasants planned to dismantle it literally brick by brick. It wasn't meant to be an act of looting. It was very strictly controlled until it all went horribly wrong when somebody accidentally set fire to the store of gunpowder in the cellar, and the entire building was blown apart, and nothing in this picture was left standing. So the site stayed derelict until 1502, when Henry VII commissioned a hospital to be built there. This was completed in 1512 and was opened by his son Henry VIII. The hospital was partly taken over by the army in the 1670s and was then also used as a prison through to the early 19th century. Now here's another picture of the hospital come prison building, and behind it you've got St Bride's Church on Fleet Street, just to orientate yourself. But again, you can see its lovely river frontage, a very fine building, but it was doomed, and it was doomed for the building of Waterloo Bridge. Now, you have to bear in mind that until the advent of the internal combustion engine, a horse and cart needed quite a long run up to get onto any sort of slope of a bridge. The Waterloo Bridge is raised up to the level of the top of the embankment, but that meant at the river frontage you needed a long circular ramp to get horses and carts up onto the bridge. And of course, the land for that is where this building was standing. Another reason for demolishing it was that it was badly damaged by a fire in the 1820s. Now, there is a surviving bit, not of the palace, but of that last building I saw you. And this is the 1512 Savoy Chapel. It's still there today. It survived all the vicissitudes over the centuries, including a very bad fire again in 1864, when the site was being redeveloped. There's an extraordinary sort of, well, symmetry, but remember how Windsor Castle was nearly destroyed by fire because it was being restored? Well, the same thing happened to this chapel. After it was rescued, however, it was decided to restore it completely and turn it into the chapel of the Duchy of Lancaster. And also, for those of you who are church aficionados, this is a royal peculiar, which means that it's answerable only to the crown. There's no bishop in charge of it. So that's the interior, that's the exterior. Inside, it is absolutely exquisite. It is it contains coats of arms and stained glass, celebrating all the members of the House of Lancaster. That's from John of Gaunt through to Henry VIII. It's a very opulent building and was remodeled in the 19th century in the style of the Pugin's Gothic revival. So it's very similar in feel and look to the Houses of Parliament. But in 1939, George VI made it the headquarters of the Royal Victorian Order, and that's its main function today. If you're in that part of London, it is open, it's free, anybody can just go in and admire it. It's got an interpretation gallery alongside. But do check first, because obviously if the Royal Victorian Order has a major ceremonial, on the day concerned, it will not be open. But it also does host concerts and other events you can go to. If you haven't been in it, you have really missed the trick. Now let's have a look up from the chapel at the townscape we're looking at. Again, you can see that sharp rise in ground level as you come off the level of the top of the embankment up to the level of what's now the Strand, and this is the other side of, that's the Savoy Hotel, and the Strand's running the other side of it. Now, the next house I want to look at is Durham House, which is slightly to the west. Again, this is more of a reimagining than a sketch, but again, you can see a fortified-looking tower here and here, water entrance, walls round it. It's got all the hallmarks of a palace, and there's a great hall inside it. Now, the bishops of Durham, who gave their name, they built this palace, and it was then seized by the crown, and it was passed eventually to the Dukes of Northumberland. And in 1553, it was the setting there of the first act in the attempt to have Lady Jane Grey usurp the throne. She was married inside this building to Lord Guildford Dudley, who was Northumberland's son, so that she would have a malleable Protestant consort once she was confirmed as queen. It was thought that women, of course, couldn't possibly reign by themselves. A problem, of course, Mary Queen of Scots and then Mary Tudor and Elizabeth had. But in this case, they thought they'd solved the problem before it started and marry her off to this amenable man. It didn't work, as you will know. It all ended very badly for all concerned. The next resident of note, still in the building looking like this, was Sir Walter Raleigh, and he spent his time here practicing black magic and planning his voyage to discover El Dorado. Now, of course, none of that worked out very well for him. So the house was a fairly checkered history, and after that episode, it began to fall into disrepair and was not treated as a sort of adjunct to a royal palace. So what happened afterwards? This is, I think, one of the most interesting sites in London. After the mid-17th century, when the house had fallen into disrepair, it was acquired eventually in 1768 by John Adam, the famous architect. And he developed the whole site as a neoclassical model housing estate called the Adelphi. And of course, you'll realise the name Adelphi has stuck to this part of London. There's an office block and a theatre also called the Adelphi here. Now, this is a surviving part of Adams's model housing development, and very elegant classical housing it is. Another part of the site, by the way, is still called Durham House and is the home of the Royal Society of Arts. Now, another part of the site has been redeveloped in the 1930s with this remarkably fine Art Deco tall office block called, as you will see, the Adelphi. It's actually called the New Adelphi, and was built between 1936 and 1938. And there is also a very steep climb from the Adelphi down to the embankment. It's steeper than any of the climbs we've seen so far. Now let's move along a bit, and our next house next to the Adelphi is called York or Buckingham House. I'll explain why it has different titles as we go through its history. This was a mansion on the Strand, originally owned by the bishops of Norwich. It then was passed to the Duke of Suffolk by Henry VIII, and eventually it was granted to the Archbishops of York during Mary Tudor's reign, when she tried to re-establish Catholicism. So it was owned briefly by by Mary's Catholic Archbishop of York, and that's where the name York came from, and rather curiously has stuck to the house and the site ever since. In the 1620s, George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham and James I's favourite and alleged lover, gave the house a lavish Baroque makeover. So we're looking at this Baroque mansion on the Thames here. And in front of it, we have a Watergate, which is not quite the one you see today. It's a predecessor. And again, you'll see a fortified wall round the site, and behind here is a tower. So it's got all the hallmarks we've been looking at earlier. Now let's have a look at the Watergate today. Here, by the way, this is the 17th century view of it, which is actually does slightly more justice to it. But that's what you see today, and it is a wonderful survival. So it is magnificent Baroque water entrance. The other thing to note is, of course, where the water is. Here, in the 18th century, you can bring a boat up to it, and it really is the Watergate. In the 21st century, it's a long way from the river and quite a bit higher. But it's there. And when I first took the walk there, I had the great pleasure of somebody saying, I thought I knew this part of London, but I've never seen that before. It's the only survival of Buckingham's house, but it does give an impression of what the architecture would have looked like in some detail. It clearly was reflected the architecture of the house behind it. Now, let's have another look at that Watergate today. And I'm sorry, this is a little bit murky, but that's the Watergate there. I've arrowed it in. And you're now looking across the embankment gardens. And this is the point to talk about what Joseph Bazalgette did in this part of London and how that affects the topography. In the 1850s, there was a problem called the Great Stink, when the River Thames got so polluted, it became impossible to stand next to the river, and the Parliament had to close, for example, because of the stench inside the Palace of Westminster. And in response to this, a massive engineering project was developed to change the river completely. And this work was completed in the 1860s. And what happened was that the foreshores reclaimed, an embankment was built that had the effect of narrowing the Thames and also speeding up its flow, which helped with moving the polluted water away. But the other thing which really helped was building a massive sewer just behind the new embankment, and doubling it up with an underground railway underneath the embankment and a new road surface on top. It's a huge engineering project, and only now is it having to be replaced. It really has stood the test of time, but there's a new huge Thames sewer project going on, because Bazalgette's project only held out for 150 years. Now, to complete the story of what goes on here, this building here is called York Buildings, so the name York is still commemorated here. And when the second Duke of Buckingham sold all of the site for speculative property development, he did so on one condition, which was that his father's, the first Duke's, titles and names would all be commemorated in the layout of the streets. So we have the amazing experience, if you walk round behind this building, of having a system of roads that spell out George Court, Villiers Street, Duke Street, but that's now been renamed as Adam Street, and Buckingham Street. And there was, believe it or not, an Of Alley to complete the whole picture of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. Sadly, Of Alley is now defunct. Now, the next building along was Hungerford House. We've got no pictures of what the original Hungerford House looked like, but this is a picture of the grandest building on the site before the present day one. Now, this site, and actually the couple next door to it, are slightly odd ones out. They were originally owned by what are called alien priories. Now, this isn't a cross between the X-Files and the Inquisition. This was the name of religious orders that came across with William the Conqueror and were then granted land in England. And a batch of them had these sites along what's now the west end of the Strand and would be the south side of Trafalgar Square. The alien priories were all closed down by Henry V as a prelude to his Agincourt campaign. So they then became Crown estate. And this particular site here was eventually granted by Henry IV to one of his staunchest supporters, Sir Walter Hungerford. And that's where the name Hungerford House comes from. And those of you who know that part of London will realise that Hungerford is still commemorated now in the name of the railway bridge that connects Charing Cross Station to the south bank of the Thames. I must admit, for donkey's years, I wondered where on earth that name came from. And it's because it was originally owned by the Hungerford family. So this picture is of the market building, which is still on the site, serviced obviously by barges coming in on the Thames, which was the main fruit and vegetable market for a long time in this part of London. But I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. Hungerford House was a very, very important power base for this Lancastrian family, who thrived under Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, and played a very important role in the Wars of the Roses, and then came into favour again under Henry VII, because the youngest member of the family played a heroic role on the battlefield of Bosworth Field and gained great favour from Henry VII. However, it all ended very badly under Henry VIII, when the last and that direct line of heroes from Bosworth actually went mad and in a psychotic episode tried to murder Henry VIII. And it was the greatest danger Henry VIII was ever in personally. And it didn't come from any enemies. It came to a man who he thought was a boyhood friend. The extraordinary end of the saga. After that, the house fell into disrepute, was into disrepair, and was replaced by this magnificent market building. Then that was bought up by the South East Railway Company, who relocated the vegetable market to the other side of the Strand, which is Covent Garden Market, and built there the Charing Cross Railway Station, and of course preserved the name Hungerford for the name of the bridge that brought the trains across. So it's a quite remarkable saga, which involves the Wars of the Roses, railway history. Well, I'll move on. The next building along has two names, Suffolk House or Northumberland House. It started off being owned by the Dukes of Suffolk and then was bought up by the Dukes of Northumberland. And this is a picture by Canaletto of the building in its heyday, a magnificent Baroque building. And it was built to look like this to overawe the Banqueting House built by James I. So it was actually built to annoy James I by being bigger and grander than the Banqueting House, which again we will see in a moment. It has a distinction of being the very last of the palaces on this part of the river that was still lived in right through to the 19th century by aristocrats. So when everybody else had left the riverbank, the Dukes of Northumberland were still holding court here. And it wasn't abandoned until the late 19th century and was then redeveloped. There's another building on the same site. If you go there today, what's very striking from today's building, which isn't obvious from this picture, is that it's a triangular site with the wide end here and a very narrow tapering point at the back of the building. And that allows for the Thames River to do its right angled turn at that point. Now let's move on to the next building, which again we haven't unfortunately got any much of a picture of. This is Scotland Yard, and this is from a map, and it shows roughly what the buildings would have been. This is the Wenceslas Hollar map of London from the early 17th century. Now, some of you may think Scotland Yard, what's it got to do with Scotland? It's all about the police, isn't it? No, the clue is in the name. This is a Scottish royal palace, and it was granted to the kings of Scotland by Edward the Confessor, so that when they came to London to pay homage to him at his new Westminster Abbey and visit him at his new Westminster Palace, they would have a London base that was easy distance from Westminster. And that's where the name Scotland Yard comes from. The site was, I say, reserved for them right through the Middle Ages. But the last Scottish royal to live there was Margaret, Queen of Scots, who was Henry VIII's older sister. Now, she had fled from Scotland in the aftermath of the Battle of Flodden in 1513, when a coup d'etat removed her from influence there after her husband was killed on the battlefield. She fled south and took over Scotland Yard and used it as the base for plotting her return to power. Well, she was helped in this by her brother Henry, in particular by Cardinal Wolsey. And she was, of course, eventually successful and got restored to power in Scotland to preside over the regency for James V. But as part of her plan, however, she had to sell Scotland Yard to Cardinal Wolsey, who then incorporated it into his own growing Palace of Westminster. And then until it was burned down in 1691, I'm sorry, that was a plot spoiler, it served alternately as government offices and as government apartments, but it was never much valued by the Crown estate, although its most famous resident was Sir Christopher Wren, who lived there while he was working in the Restoration period on the final works in that phase of the development of Somerset House. Now, I am going to use the magic of zoom to jump both geographically and in time to look at the Palace of Westminster next, and then come back north to look at the Palace of Whitehall. Whitehall's here, and Westminster is well to the south, further down the river. The reason for doing that is the story of these two palaces is chronological, and the story of Westminster blends into the story of Whitehall. So let's go down and look at a reimagining of the medieval Palace of Westminster. So here we've got the river in front of it. Here we have the one surviving building from that palace, which is the Great Hall, built by William II, and behind it here is Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey was the most important religious space in early medieval London, or in England, I should say, and Westminster Hall was the most important secular space. So it's no accident the two are side by side. So that's Edward the Confessor's work, this is William II's work. For those of you who know the Palace of Westminster, and orientate you a little bit here, this building running across the site is now the corridor that takes you into the central lobby between the two chambers of Parliament. But it's actually St Stephen's Chapel, which was the original home of Parliament for many centuries. And today, if you come through it, you get into the lobby here, and you've got the House of Lords on one side and the House of Commons on the other side. So that was the layout of the medieval palace. The whole of this palace burnt down in 1512, and this was a personal tragedy for Henry VIII, who was king at the time, because like Henry VII and then Edward IV before him, it had been his favourite London palace. This is where Edward IV most enjoyed living in London. It's where Henry VIII grew up, and it was his childhood home, and he was devastated by its loss. The only bits that survived were the Great Hall, but the site was redeveloped on the same sort of footprint, but in a very different way. It was never turned back into a domestic palace again. And it's a wonderful term that John Stowe used. He says, the palace as a domestic palace was never re-edified. So what happened to it after it burned down? Well, Cardinal Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, as Archbishop of York, owned York House. And this turned into Whitehall Palace. And I'll just jump forward and show you the sheer scale and size of Whitehall Palace at its greatest extent. It's absolutely huge area. Only about half of it's built up, but almost half of it was built up. And it was the largest palace in Europe in its heyday, significantly bigger than Versailles. And it contained, as well as all the buildings in it, it also contained a tilt yard, orchards, gardens, a deer park. It contained archery butts, a whole range of things needed to support a very expansive royal lifestyle. And some of you are beginning to think, if it's the biggest palace in Europe, where is it? Well, this is actually where it is, and I'll now explain why, if you go there, you actually can't see it with the exception of one single building. So as I say, the Cardinal Wolsey owned all of this, most of this site, and we'll unpack that again in a moment. And he offered it to Henry VIII as a substitute for his lost Palace of Westminster. And now I'll look at exactly how that worked. Here we have where it all started, with the great hall of the Palace of Westminster. And what you've got here is a little sketch, and that's the great hall. And this is a reimagining of what the original buildings here looked like. And this was built by Henry III's chief justiciar, Hubert de Burgh. And he built himself this palace here to be very handy for Westminster. And it dates back to dates back to 1230. Not long after that, it was passed to the Archbishops of York to be their London base, under a rather curious arrangement. Each archbishop owned it as his own personal private property. And it's that connection with York which gives it the name of York Place. Now, the last Archbishop of York who lived here was Cardinal Wolsey, and he then gifted it, because it was his personal property, to Henry VIII in 1529 as a last-ditch desperate effort to curry favour and save his own skin. Well, as you probably know, it didn't work. Henry accepted the palace, but still had Wolsey dismissed from his offices, stripped of his other property and offices, and arrested for treason. Now, we have seen that Wolsey turned York Place into a royal palace and a seat of government. But what would Wolsey's Palace of Whitehall have looked like? And the answer is, it would have looked like this. This is the east end of Westminster Abbey. And the reason I say that Wolsey's Palace of Whitehall would look like this is, this was completed just as the Palace of Westminster burned down. So there was already on site a skilled workforce who built this building, which was opened in Henry VIII's reign. And Wolsey simply moved them all up the road to use the same materials, the same designs, the same techniques to embellish his new palace. The one big difference was that he refacaded the original Great Hall in the whitest stone he could find. And that's where the name Whitehall comes from. And Henry VIII particularly liked the name Whitehall because it meant he didn't have to use the name York anymore to describe the new palace he was moving into, because he was feeling quite guilty about what he'd done to Cardinal Wolsey. Now, this is a picture of the palace at its greatest extent, or a picture of the buildings, I should say, and you've got part of what's now St James's Park in the foreground. Looking at this, you've got the Banqueting House, which we'll look at in a moment here. This building is called the Holbein Gate, and it was a triumphal arch in the middle. And then you move along here, and you eventually get to the Palace of Westminster at the right-hand end. Now, everything in this picture was destroyed in a fire in a single night in 1691. In terms of acreage, it was nearly as big a fire as the Great Fire of London in 1666. But unlike the Great Fire of London, not even a single person was injured by this fire. It just only destroyed buildings. William III, who was king at the time, vowed to rebuild it, just as Henry VIII had vowed to rebuild the Palace of Westminster. But like Henry VIII, he didn't keep his word, he didn't rebuild it. And it then was redeveloped very much piecemeal. What we've got here is the one surviving building. This is the architectural gem of the Palace of Whitehall. It's Indigo Jones's Banqueting House. Today, it's one of the historic royal palaces, and you can visit it for a fee and admire it. And if you haven't been there, it's wonderful. Its greatest claim to fame is that Charles I was executed in front of it. A huge scaffold was erected right across the road, and this window was turned into a doorway, and Charles I walked out of here onto the scaffold and was executed up at this sort of first floor level. Now, for completeness, let's have a look at what's happened to the site thereafter. So this is just south of the Banqueting House, and this is today's Ministry of Defence building, which is on the site. Let me just go back a moment. It's on the site of this building, exactly following that footprint. This is a magnificent, if very austere, Art Deco come classical building, which was designed in the 1930s, began to be built in the late 1930s, was actually completed in 1940. It's a very fine building, and we're going to return to it for an unexpected episode momentarily. But in the meantime, there's one last palace I want to look at, which is on the site of the original Palace of Whitehall, and that's Richmond House. Now, this was built, the second building on the site was built in 1730, and it's very much a neoclassical building. It was built for the Dukes of Richmond. It also doubled up as government offices. And it housed an extensive art collection, which was rescued when it was burned down in 1791. And most of that artwork is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So that's the original classical design. What you've got on the site today is architecturally fascinating. You've got this building, which is a recreation of the classical Richmond House. And just to orientate you, the Ministry of Defence is just off to our left here. But round the corner in there, you've got this facade here. And this is Richmond House today, where the Department of Health is. And this picks up the architectural themes from that east end of Westminster Abbey I showed you earlier. And inside, running right across the whole front of the building, is a huge conference hall, which has the most wonderful vaulted ceiling. The vaulting in this building being in concrete, not in stone. I think it's a wonderful building. It has been listed. It keeps coming up in the news for different reasons. There was a plan to give it to an Arab kingdom, I think, recently. Another plan to relocate the Houses of Parliament and do it. It is a superb building. Also, as a warning of all these buildings, as they are government offices, unlike some of the other buildings I've shown you, like the Banqueting House or the Savoy Chapel, you can't just go in. You have to have a reason for going in, an appointment and someone to meet you in there. So sadly, you won't be able to see that. Now, we're almost at the end. I want to go back to an extraordinary survival in the Palace of Westminster, the Palace of Whitehall, I should say. I said it was burned to the ground except for the Banqueting Hall in 1691. To the ground, the operative word. A few bits of it survived underground. I've seen one of them, which is the foundations for Henry VIII's tennis court, and they're underneath the Privy Council offices. You can't get into them, but take my word for it, they're there. But when I was on a visit to the offices on business many years ago now, they were very proud to show me these wonderful Tudor walls around the tennis court. But the one which is absolutely the gem of rediscovery is this. And this is Henry VIII's wine cellar in the Palace of Whitehall. And no one knew that was still there until they started building the new Ministry of Defence I showed you a moment ago. And in the process of preparing the groundwork and the foundations, they discovered this completely intact early Tudor, huge vaulted room. And it was dismantled and rebuilt on site. And it now sits exactly underneath the middle of the Ministry of Defence. And it is now the Ministry of Defence's staff social club. But you'll notice that it has the same sort of vaulting as you'll see inside the east end of Westminster Abbey. So it's an absolutely wonderful architectural gem and a wonderful architectural rescue story. Now, I'm going to leave you here at the end of our walk in the wine cellar, enjoying the company of the merry monarch or the homicidal maniac, depending on how you look at him. But I need to move on to give a few of what I might call parish notices before I hand back to Kyla to carry on sort of hosting. And the first one is to remind you that next week, not next week, the week after next, 3rd or 4th of November, York has its Giving Day. And that's the little flyer for it. And you will find and I might put this back up again in a moment, this link to how you can donate for Giving Day, which also describes all sorts of projects that are being done. And another part of this is we are having an alumni pub quiz on 24th of November at 7 p.m. This is a change to the originally advertised date, so do keep watching the website, and if you want to join in, do log on to it. So let's just go back and leave you with Henry VIII, and I will now stop screen sharing for a moment and pass you back to Kyla to carry on with the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Peter. Absolutely fascinating. Couple of quick questions. I know that we're running very short on time. We might be slightly over. The first is, if the next time I'm in London, I've only got time to visit one site, where would that be? Where would you recommend the one place that I go and visit on the tour?
Oh, I think of all the places I've shown you, it would be the Savoy Chapel. But if you've got time, because they're not far apart, you could take a refreshment break at Somerset House, because they're not very far apart on foot.
Thank you. And I quite fancy a trip to the Savoy. And could you also, Lauren has asked, who did the painting that you showed of the Buckingham Watergate? Do you know?
Oh, yes, I do, but I would need to go back into it. It begins with a D. He's a famous painter. Do you want me to try and dig back into that while you're talking? I should be able to find it.
No, I think that's absolutely fine. What we can always do, Lauren, is if you want to drop an email to alumni@york.ac.uk, I'm sure that we'll be able to find that out for you and answer you via email, if that's okay. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
I think sadly that's probably all that we have time for. I am so sorry that we're not going to be able to answer more questions, but I'm very, very grateful to Peter for all his time and for everything that he's done researching this for us this evening. I must just apologise, Peter. I think I referred to you as Mr. Peter Burley earlier on, when of course it should be Dr. Peter Burley. I do apologise for that. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We've got people joining us from all around the world this evening, and we've had well over 200 participants, which has been fantastic. Thank you. So we look forward to welcoming you for Giving Day next, the week after next, and of course for the London quiz in due course as well. Thank you everybody, and goodbye for now.